Our topic today is modernity reconsidered. Specifically, we try to reconfigure or reconsider the idea of modernity from East Asian perspective, especially from the East Asian Confucian perspective. Since I'm involved in this series of Reischauer lectures, maybe I'll begin with a quote from Edwin Reischauer, who's, of course, he was professor of East Asian Studies at Harvard, director of Harvard Yanjin Institute, and then one of the most successful and impressive American ambassadors to Japan, and a scholar who was trained in Paris, in Beijing, in Kyoto, of course in Cambridge. And he was a sinologist, a leading authority on Japan, and of course an action intellectual in the best sense of the term. The reason I mention him is try to use what now we call a Confucian hypothesis as a way of understanding this question of modernity reconsidered. As early as 1973, Professor Reischauer offered a very thought-provoking article prepared for the conference on the dynamics of Northeast Asia, arranged by the Asia Society of New York and held in Japan in November 1973. A very short article later was published in Foreign Affairs and turned out to be an extremely important article, published in 1974. He suggests in that article that in recent centuries, the secular ethics of Confucianism, this is his term, I will not call Confucian ethics secular, but the secular ethics of Confucianism has played the unifying role in East Asia that Christianity has played in the West. As an illustration, he observes, I quote, "The basic ethical concepts and value systems of the four countries of East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, are surprisingly uniform. For example, all show a strong emphasis on family solidarity, on filial piety, on subordination of the individual to the group, on the ideal of group harmony as opposed to a balance between conflicting rights, on social organization, on care for political as opposed to religious or purely cultural integration, on hard work as a value in itself, on frugality, and on education as morally uplifting and the proper role to personal and family success. Though the Japanese have added to these values a special emphasis on stoicism, martial values, and extra family loyalties derived from their feudal past. Seen in such basic terms, East Asia has been in the past and still in many ways every bit as much of a cultural unit as in the West." This is 73. Around the same time, a futurologist who was not a China scholar or scholar East Asian studies, but the head of the Hudson Institute, very much involved in strategic analysis of global conditions, by the name of Herman Kahn, first argued that the rise of Japan and possibly other societies under the influence of Chinese culture, such as Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, or Hong Kong, is not simply an economic phenomenon. It is also an important cultural phenomenon. The motivating force behind all these societies may turn out to be Confucian ethics. This is a proposal he made in the 70s. At the time, very few people considered that as a very persuasive argument. They're much more interested in social political trends, economic developments. Then Professor McFarquhar, who's teaching in the Department of Government here, at the time he was working for BBC, and later he became a member of the Parliament of England, and the editor of China Quarterly, one of the most influential journals in studying of contemporary China. He published in 1980 a very succinct article in the famous journal, The Economist, and entitled The Post-Confucian Challenge. In that article, again, he argues that the rise of industry in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and so forth, signaled a different form of life, a different style of modernity. So the challenge of the former Soviet Union at the time was a military challenge. At the time, of course, because of the petroleum issue, the challenge of the Middle Eastern countries with a great deal of oil resources was basically economic. Whereas the challenge of East Asia, from his point of view, is the signal of the possibility of a different form of modernity. This is the basis, the broad basis. It took about 20 years, I guess, more than 20 years, for Professor Peter Berger, a leading sociologist, now teaches at Boston University, to formulate this idea, what he called the post-Confucian hypothesis. The post-Confucian hypothesis, from his point of view, is the rise of different kind of capitalism, different form, by implication, a different form of democracy, maybe a different form of ethics, which is modernistic to the core, very modern, and yet in a way very different from the values of the Enlightenment that contributed to the rise of the modern West. So for the first time in recent history, for the 150 years, that the Western model gradually, even though still extremely strong, are being challenged by a different model of modernity. My sense of the situation is a bit different. My sense of the situation is that East Asian societies, the reason that the East Asian societies turned out to be challenging to the West was precisely these societies for more than 150 years have been thoroughly westernized, precisely because they actively tried to be westernized, imported all kinds of Western ideas, even at the expense of their own cultural traditions, was a precondition for their ability to compete in the West, with the West. And it's a mixed blessing. From the Confucian point of view, I'm not arguing that these societies exhibit Confucian virtues as we discuss it in this class. In fact, these societies are very much under the influence of Western mercantilism, commercialism, fierce competitiveness, and so forth. The reason is because cultural China, the term I use very broadly, cultural China, which means People's Republic of China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, Singapore, Chinese communities throughout the world, in an active way for a very long period of time, ever since the period of May 4th of the early part of the 19th century, has been practicing what may be called iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is an attack on the tradition. An attack on the tradition, meaning that they want to distance themselves from the tradition and consider the Confucian tradition as the feudal past. They want to distance them from the tradition. And it's very powerful. Iconoclasm and nationalism, on the surface, two very different forces, shaped the modern Chinese mind, not just in the People's Republic of China, but outside of China. The Chinese intellectuals were convinced that the problem of China's backwardness vis-a-vis the powerful West, defined in terms of wealth and power, was not only because the Chinese mechanism of defense was not good enough, certainly it was not good enough, not simply because the institutional structures were not strong enough, not simply because the social organizations were strong enough. It was because there's something fundamentally wrong with Chinese culture. And the reason why it is fundamentally wrong with the Chinese culture is that Confucianism, especially institutionalized ideology, Confucian political ideology, is bankrupt. Therefore, to attack the Confucian tradition was a defining characteristic of the modern Chinese mind ever since the turn of the century, for a long time. And so it's possible for us to say traditional Chinese culture in the consciousness of a modern Chinese intellectual is a distant echo. They know very little about what's going on. Most of the things we discuss here, the 4 books, are not part of the mental furniture of these intellectuals at all. The sedimentation in the modern Chinese cultural tradition, in fact, is a very complicated one. The tremendous iconoclastic attack on the tradition, a great deal of Western ideas, distorted Western ideas, not necessarily the true spirit of liberty, equality, dignity of the person, but science as technology, as a way of transforming society, democracy as a way of mobilizing popular sentiments, mobilizing the masses for social transformation. And also, China, for example, for the last 50 years, People's Republic of China has been dominated by Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism. Each one of them is intrinsically incompatible with the Confucian style of moral reasoning that is being discussed here. And the most powerful discourse in China, we can see it all over the world, is scientism. So a typical Chinese intellectual in this sense is someone who believes science is a panacea. The reason that so many Chinese are outstanding scientists, engineers, and very few of them are in the social sciences, still fewer in the humanities, is very much the mentality that evolved out of the May 4th tradition. In the turn of the century, most of the Chinese students who came to the United States studied philosophy, sociology, literature, politics. Then ever since the 30s and 40s, most of the Chinese who came to the United States studied science and engineering. Now 80%, 85% of Chinese from anywhere, from People's Republic of China, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from Southeast Asia, were in natural sciences. This has never been the case in traditional China, but it's a modern phenomenon. So scientism, worshiping science, is a kind of hegemonic discourse. That's the reason that it's very difficult for the modern Chinese mind to appreciate spiritual values, including the ethical religious dimensions of the Confucian tradition. It's a distant echo, it's somehow lost. But the situation drastically changed in the last 20 or 30 years. To say the Chinese intellectuals become unmusical to religious matters or Confucian ideas is not to say, this is very important, not to say that Confucian ethics has lost its persuasive power in East Asia. No, not at all. If we take the notion of the habits of the heart seriously, the conventional way of thinking, how you're being shaped by forces, cultural forces, ethical religious forces you are not even critically aware of. The Confucian tradition continues to be powerful among the Chinese farmers or peasants, Chinese merchants, Chinese workers, and Chinese intellectuals. So the Chinese intellectuals can be, at their conscious, articulate level, extremely iconoclastic against the Confucian tradition. And yet, in their behavior, in their ways of educating their children, in their ways of self-understanding, in their sense of power, of influence, the Confucian values continue to be extremely important. This is not unusual. This is actually quite common. I'll give you one example. According to Max Weber, who talked about the rise of the spirit of capitalism and the relationship between the spirit of capitalism and Protestant ethic or Puritanic ethic. He made an observation, a pastor, a Christian missionary, once made a remark that to a Christian, wealth is like a cloak. You can take it off anytime you see fit. There's no need for you to be constrained by wealth as a Christian, because Christian faith is basically not at all under the influence of wealth. You know, in the biblical literature, it's so difficult for a wealthy man to go to heaven, right? Max Weber then commented, without knowing, 100 years after that, the light cloak has now become an iron cage, in the sense that originally, when the Protestant ethic emerged that contributed to the rise of capitalism, most of the Protestants did not take wealth that seriously. But after the economic power gained tremendous momentum, 100 years later, you're caught in this iron cage. In that sense, the unintended consequence of the Protestant ethic, which is a distorted version of Christianity, became a much more powerful force in the society than the Christian message itself. That's very much true with the Confucian ideas. Many of the Confucian ideas that became important in East Asia turned out to be distorted ideas. The ideas made self-cultivation is not simply for your spiritual self-transformation. It is a psychological mechanism for you to become even a more fierce competitor in terms of economic gain, in terms of political power. But recently, there's a rise of national learning in the sense of trying to retrieve the cultural resources, including the Confucian tradition, as a stand of inspiration. But still, this is only in the beginning. This is the first generation of intellectuals in the People's Republic of China that begin to do that. It is in this sense that when we look at the rise of industrial East Asia, it's going to form a new kind of modernity which may even challenge the West. I'm not putting any kind of positive value to that phenomenon. I'm just describing it. In fact, it may turn out to be disastrous for all parties concerned. But there's no question about the fact there's a new challenge. And this new challenge may be deeply rooted in some highly distorted Confucian values. The strength of industrial East Asia, simply put, is twofold. I noted in some of my writings. They have thoroughly domesticated the kind of Western expertise or the Western know-how that is instrumental in international competition. To be an East Asian intellectual, whether Japanese, Chinese, or Korean, for the last 50 years, is to be someone who is very seasoned in American and Western learning. To know about the West is a defining characteristic of being an important, self-reflective East Asian intellectual. But at the same time, they have successfully mobilized indigenous resources in developing political leadership and social cohesiveness congenial to economic growth. In other words, they've learned to know their competitors, and they have their indigenous resources their competitors are totally oblivious of. That's the reason why they're so competitive. They have been devoted students, as I noted before, of Dutch learning, English learning, French learning, German learning, and more recently, American learning. And many of these societies, including China now, have very limited land, unlike the United States, right? Limited land for cultivation, limited natural resources, intense population pressure. The human factor is central to their overall development and their development strategy. And in this sense, what they show is that cultural matters, that values they cherish, and even unconsciously uphold, provide guidance for their action. The so-called Confucian hypothesis, based upon Weber's argument that there is a link between Protestant ethic, which is in the Christian tradition, and the rise of the spirit of capitalism, is to say that the Confucian ethic, sometimes distorted version of it, not the kind that we've been discussing here, turned out to be important in shaping East Asian economy, polity, society, and culture. So what emerged in East Asia turned out to be a very different form of mixture, therefore a different kind of modernity. So the phenomena of the rise of East Asia challenges many of our fundamental conceptions about economic development, about social organization, about democratization, even about some of the salient features of modernity. Professor Taco Parsons defined modernity in terms of three inseparable dimensions based upon experience of the West, especially of America. One is market economy, the second is democratic polity, third one is individualism. No society can be considered modern if the society doesn't have a vibrant market economy, a mature democratic polity, and a cultural expression that can be understood as a form of individualism. The three are inseparable, they're all combined. In ethical terms, what Confucian East Asia exemplifies is a significantly different form of modernity. Market economy, democratic polity, and individualism are all present in East Asian modernity. But governmental leadership, meritocracy, and communitarianism have so fundamentally restructured the market as the invisible hand, democracy as an adversarial system, you mean a system based upon checks and balances, and the individualistic ethos, that the basic rules defining modernity in Western Europe and North America do not necessarily apply. To imagine that as East Asian societies become further modernized, they'll become more like us, they'll be Americanized, is highly problematical. One possibility, I want to simply offer this as a kind of imaginative possibility. That is, it's possible toward the 21st century for the American society to survive. Many of the features of American society would be more like East Asian. Of course, some of the East Asian features would be Americanized. I'm not saying there's East Asianization of the American way of life. That's not necessarily the message. The message is, as we continue to develop the kind of market economy, democratic polity, individualism that Taco Parsons believe inseparable to defining characteristic of America would be so drastically changed. The kind of modernity that emerged, or post-modernity emerged in the West, in some way would be closer to the East Asian model. This, of course, is a hypothesis, right? The idealized notion, this is very important, it's ethically significant. Many of you are deeply involved in this. In fact, I'm going to give a talk on this issue at MIT next Monday afternoon at 4 o'clock. The idealized notion of human beings as rights-bearing individuals, motivated by self-interests in an attempt to maximize their profit through rational calculation in the marketplace, adjudicated by a legal framework. This is very deeply rooted in American liberal democratic thinking. A person, it's a rights-bearing person, motivated by self-interest in an attempt to maximize his profit through rational calculation in the marketplace, adjudicated by the legal framework. This model of a person, of an individual, is being very seriously challenged. The Confucian perception of the person as essential relationships and the Confucian emphasis on duty consciousness, general well-being, rightness, not rights, but rightness, sympathy, and the moral transformation of ritual may turn out to be just as persuasive as a way of learning to be human in a modern context. The representation of the problematique or the problem of community in European and American political discourses in recent years is actually symptomatic of the confluence of two apparently contradictory or conflicting forces. Globalization on the one hand, we talked about, and localization in the other. We need to find various kinds of intellectual traditions, spiritual traditions that will be able to help us to deal with this incredibly complicated process in the modernizing context. In other words, we need to find ethics that will be able to help us to deal with the interplay between globalization and localization. The need to go beyond, in a way, the need to go beyond the Enlightenment mentality without either deconstructing or abandoning its commitment to rationality, liberty, equality, human rights, and distributive justice, requires a thorough re-examination of modernity. Modernity itself as a very layered concept, a very complicated concept, but also to understand the whole question of modernization as a very complex process. So in this sense, we may say that market economy without government leadership is not going to function very well. I'm not saying that I'm more in tune with the kind of democratic argument than the Republican argument. I'm not talking in terms of the current debate in American political, in the political context. I'm just simply note whether it's Republican or Democratic. To say the government is not going to play a very important role in shaping the market economy is either hypocritical or unreal. But government's role is absolutely crucial. And this is the East Asian model. For the first time, the World Bank recognizes that one of the major differences in the East Asian developmental model is that the government takes full responsibility for economic development. So in other words, the government is a maximum government, not a minimum government. The government is responsible not only for economic being, but for distributive justice, even for education. That does not necessarily mean the government has to be so pervasive. It's all the place. You know, we have the political rhetoric of anti-big government. But the idea of the government as leadership, as political leadership, sometimes highly diffused at the local, at the regional level, is an important aspect of the market economy. Now, if you look at East Asia, industrial East Asia, the government's role is very different, not exactly the same. Singapore, the government plays the role of direct management, which is the strongest government, even dictatorial, in the economic process. It's really social planning, but that's one form. South Korea, the government is active leadership, not directly in control, but to provide the leadership for the major international or multinational corporations to function in relationship to all kinds of other social units. There are conflicts and tensions involved, but this is the general model. In Japan, we call it informed guidance. It's neither direct management nor active leadership, but informed guidance through certain kind of social political organizations of the government to help companies to become vibrant, to become competitive. In Taiwan, they call it passive interference. Passive interference, the government does interfere, but interfere in a passive way. Not direct management, not active leadership. The most intriguing case is Hong Kong. Many scholars, like Milton Friedman, believe Hong Kong is the market economy at its best, totally laissez-faire. So the government has no role to play in Hong Kong. It's a treaty port. But the Hong Kong leadership defines their own relationship, the Hong Kong government together with the Chinese business leadership. They call their approach positive non-interference. It's non-interference, but a positive in the sense the role of the government, the role of the leadership is very, very critical. So you have many different styles. You have direct management, you have active leadership, informed guidance, passive interference, and even positive non-interference. All these indicate the role of the government is critical. The role of the political leadership is critical for market economy. This is a manifestation of Confucian ethos. The Confucian ethos is the government is totally responsible. In terms of responsibility, the government cannot abdicate its responsibility. But in terms of the particular style of leadership, the government can exercise all kinds of options. In the area of democracy, we see again a major challenge, a major contribution from East Asia is the coexistence of democratic polity and meritocracy. Meritocracy is a form of elitism. The training of political leaders becomes the major concern of all the major universities. In Hong Kong, Hong Kong University is really training the Hong Kong bureaucrats. Tokyo University is training Japanese bureaucrats. Singaporean University is training Singaporean bureaucrats. Even in Taiwan, some of the national universities actually are the major training ground for political leaders. To become involved in politics in all these East Asian societies, if not the highest calling, turn out to be very high on the priority of the overwhelming majority of students at leading universities. The United States is quite exceptional. If you look at Germany, look at France and other societies, the situation is different. I think now, if we look at our own record, the percentage of people that want to go into public service, not to private practice in terms of law, not to private companies in terms of business, is extremely small and shrinking. But I think the situation has to change. You cannot have a society that the political leadership is controlled by a low-level mediocrity, not high-level mediocrity, low-level mediocrity. No society, modern society, is able to survive very well if the key political positions are not being filled by some of the most talented people. And it is in this sense that individualism, as an ingredient of modernity, either in North America or in European societies, is being seriously challenged. For a number of years, very few people believe that it's possible to continue with the kind of social networking of East Asia, undermining the power of individualism, and it would be able to remain vibrant. But now I think for the last half a century, we show that there's a different kind of modernity which is based upon networking. In other words, if you look at a person as a central relationships, there are two kinds. One is the center. You can emphasize the center for the sake of learning for the sake of the self, in terms of dignity of the person, in terms of self-expression. But at the same time, you have to recognize it's a center of relationships, therefore the importance of networking. And increasingly, in most of the multinational corporations, the ethos of the business culture in the United States, for example, in the last few decades, is to move away from the individual-centered mechanism of control or upward social mobility. If individualism and social networking will have to be combined in some special feature, what happens in East Asia, I think Reichauer, of course, somewhat exaggerated a point, that is that whole notion, the subordination of the individual to the group. This ethos, the subordination of the individual to the group, is being very seriously challenged in all East Asian countries, even in terms of permanent employment, loyalty to the company, loyalty to one's profession, and so forth. Even Japan is no longer to maintain that. Individual expressions become critical. So many people observing that phenomena easily conclude that these societies eventually would be like us, very much shaped by the individualistic ethos. But so far, it's not happening. The situation is much more complicated. In fact, our society, American society, is being shaped more and more by communitarian ethic. Despite the fact that individualism continues to be powerful, but it's being so powerfully challenged by communitarian ethic that many people believe that habits of the heart of the United States, as shaped by individualism, is being reconfigured in a new context. The East Asian intellectuals are now actively involved in probing the Confucian tradition as a spiritual resource for economic development, nation building, social stability, and cultural identity. But the echoes of the iconoclastic anti-tradition attacks on Confucius and the Confucian tradition still reverberate in the academy and in the intellectual ethos. And the irony for me, actually, is that the Confucian personality ideals that we talked about here, to be an authentic person, to be a profound person, to learn to be a worthy or to learn to be a sage, these Confucian ideals can be realized in the modern context. I'm not talking about historical situation. In the modern context, can be realized more fully in a liberal democratic society than either in a traditional imperial dictatorship or a modern authoritarian regime. It's an irony, but it's very important to observe that the kind of personality ideas we discussed here, from my point of view, as the highest manifestation of Confucian personality ideal, is more realizable in a society like American than either traditional Chinese society or Korean society or Japanese society or modern dictatorial societies, whether in the People's Republic of China or in Singapore. It is in this sense we find some of the values that on the surface, historically speaking, are alien to our way of thinking. The values of communitarian ethic as opposed to individualistic ethic, the value of meritocracy as an integral part of democratization, the value of the market as being very much adjudicated or controlled by the government. These are alien to the intellectual and spiritual development of the modern West. And yet, if we look into the future, these are some of the values this society is desperately in need of. It is pretty intriguing to observe that in recent decades, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, we see a second migration of East Asians from Southeast Asia, from Taiwan, or from Hong Kong to North America, and to Australia, to New Zealand. This is extremely intriguing. Chinese, Koreans, to a certain extent Japanese, of course very much under the influence of Confucian culture, now begin to observe the fact that in the global economy, in the globalization process, societies like Canada, more so than the United States, but also Australia and New Zealand, these are basically democratic societies, if not liberal, basic democratic societies. These societies are more congenial to their human flourishing than either Southeast Asian societies or East Asian societies. Now, these are the immigrants that are very different from the immigrants of the 19th century. The 19th century immigrants from Asia did not have a choice. They left China because they came from the lowest echelon of the society. They want to find a niche in Southeast Asia, in North America, to work as coolies. And yet they came with all kinds of cultural values influenced by the Confucian tradition. That's one story. Asian American studies begin to explore that story. But in recent decades, after the Second World War, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, we see the second migration, a major migration from Southeast Asia, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and increasingly also from the People's Republic of China. This indicates a new phenomenon. I mentioned last time about major trends, global trends. And one of the major global trends turned out to be migration. A book just published, I haven't really gone through it because I discussed this issue with him, John Nesbitt, called The Megatrends Asia, just published. You may want to take a look at some of the issues and problems that he raised. In fact, he made reference to some of the issues that I explored here. And his position may be a little bit exaggerated. It's like Herman Kahn, MacFarquhar, and Berger, but now globalize it. When Herman Kahn, from Reischauer, Herman Kahn, MacFarquhar, and Berger, the kind of Confucian hypothesis is simply to say Confucian ethic contributed to the dynamic transformation of East Asia. So they became competitive on the international scene. What Nesbitt is trying to say is these mega trends that originated in East Asia are going to be totally globalized. In fact, if you look toward the 21st century, they may turn out to be the most powerful. So it's not simply Americanization or Europeanization or Westernization, but there's also East Asianization. So you have a more complicated picture. No matter how this is worked out, two questions that need to be addressed. One question is simply the continuous presence of traditions in modernity. If you get away from this lecture, nothing but one idea, that's the idea, please keep in mind. The idea of continuous presence of traditions in modernity. Try to think beyond the simple dichotomy of tradition and modernity. If you still believe that emergence of modernity means the disappearance of tradition, your conceptualization of the problem may be too simple-minded. What you need to think about is a new way of understanding what modernity really means. It's a new configuration. Recently, I edited a book, and Harvard University Press just published it. The book is simply entitled Confucian Traditions, with an S, in East Asian Modernity. Confucian Traditions in East Asian Modernity. Most of the people who contributed to that volume, altogether 17 of them, are not in the study of Confucian ethics. They're in economics, in political science, in sociology, in anthropology, in other fields. And what we learn from that joint venture is that any society, a modern society, any form of modernity, is deeply rooted in a historical or traditional consciousness. Let's take democracy, just one example. Don't have much time here. Democracy, if we don't look at democracy as a static structure, like voting behavior, but as a process of the modernizing, a process of modernization called democratization. British democracy is drastically different from French democracy. In England, traditionalism, convention, gradualism, empiricism, rationalism, all important for the development of British democracy. Whereas French democracy is linked to anti-clericalism, against religion actually, linked to the revolutionary spirit, linked to very pervasive, powerful bureaucracy, linked to the ancien regime, the old regime. German democracy is deeply rooted in the German idea of nationalism, Germans' competition with England, with France, Germans' cultural identity, Germans' sense of its place in the European context. American democracy is very deeply rooted in American civil society. In the sense, in America, not the central government, not the federal government, but all kinds of voluntary social political organizations turn out to be more important in shaping the American political culture. In this sense, no European societies, French, German, English societies, have developed very vibrant civil society. So America is very different. Now, there's no question about the fact we have a Japanese democracy, which is one party ruled primarily with many different factions. It's deeply rooted in the Japanese meritocracy, Japanese habits of the heart. We now see the emergence of a Korean democracy, which is very deeply rooted in the Korean factional strife and the interplay between students and the government, students as intellectuals of protests. We also see the emergence of a particular form of Taiwanese democracy. And again, very much involved with the popular culture, popular traditions of Taiwan. I don't have time to explore further how this conception of traditions in modernity has contributed to our rethinking of the modernizing process. I think we may want to accept the fact that the modernizing process may assume different cultural forms. One cultural form that has been distinctive in defining modernization is the European American or North American cultural form. Now we see an East Asian cultural form with Confucian ethics as its core. But we're going to see maybe an Islamic form, a Hindu form, a Buddhist form, and many other forms of the modernizing process. It is in this sense, we'll get a chance to talk about it next time, that feminist and ecological perspectives on the question of the modernizing process will have to be taken very seriously.